This is the part 2 video to an amazing question that one of my subscribers asked me about my thoughts on Sweden before I moved here. I already answered that in part 1, so if you're interested in that, hop back to part 1 and catch up before you watch this one. And this one, part 2, I'm talking about the neighboring countries that I've never been to: Norway, Iceland, Finland, and Denmark. And I'm going to talk about my thoughts on those places from what I've heard having lived here in Sweden. So let's roll that intro and get right into this.
You a fool's gold. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
So I think we're just gonna start with the south and work our way up. So basically, the neighboring country to the south of Sweden is Denmark. Never been to Denmark, never been to any of the countries that I'm talking about in this video. So I'm basically just gonna give you guys my best guess on what I think about each one of these countries, having never been there. So if I'm completely wrong, let me know in the comments section, and this should be interesting. So the things that I think about Denmark, I feel like Denmark is very, very similar to Sweden in a lot of ways, but I feel like they're also very similar to Germany in a lot of ways, being geographically located in between Sweden and Germany. So I feel like the language is a little bit closer to German, at least the way it sounds, compared to Swedish. And I also feel like some of the cultural aspects, like Germans like to drink a lot of beer. It's a lot cheaper in Germany. I've heard that the alcohol prices are cheaper in Denmark compared to Sweden. So I feel like the people in Denmark like to have a good time. They like to drink alcohol maybe a little bit more than they do here in Sweden, because the Swedes are very reserved when it comes to alcohol with Systembolaget and the way the government regulates it. So I feel like that could be one difference between Denmark and Sweden. Then I also feel like the climate is a little bit more mild being further south. Obviously it's still going to be cold because they are still considered Northern Europe, but I just feel like it's going to be a little bit more mild than Sweden, especially when you compare Denmark to the north of Sweden. Alright, the next neighbor I'm going to talk about is Norway, and I feel like Norway is probably the most similar Nordic country to Sweden because it's so close in proximity. They share a border along Sweden's west border, and I feel like the languages are also very similar between Norwegian and Swedish. And when I listen to Norwegian, after having lived in Sweden for 8 months, I can actually understand a lot of what they're saying in Norwegian. Not completely, but I can tell that those languages are very, very close. I think even closer than Swedish and Danish. When it comes to Norway, I think about the prices being much more expensive, mostly because in one of my videos I talked about how I thought things were expensive in Sweden, and I had a bunch of Norwegians commenting on that video, hey, if you think things are expensive in Sweden, come to Norway because it's like twice as much here in Norway. So from what I've heard, Norway is very, very expensive, and I've heard it's one of the most expensive countries out there. And also when I think of Norway, I think of beautiful nature, mostly because a lot of the pictures and stuff that I see and like on Instagram are from the fjords in Norway, and it looks like an absolutely beautiful area. So I definitely want to go visit that. They seem to have an amazing amount of nature activities and all that kind of stuff. So definitely trying to check that out and go to Norway. Now, since we just talked about Norway, the country to the west of Sweden, now it's time to talk about Finland, the country to the east. Now I feel like out of all these Nordic countries, I feel like Finland is just a little bit different than the other ones, just because their language is so completely different. Like Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish are all very, very similar. A lot of people that speak those languages can somewhat understand and communicate with each other, but Finnish is like on a completely different language tree. I think they're closer to like Hungarian or some of those Eastern European languages that are just completely different from the languages that they speak in the other Nordic countries. So I feel like Finland is kind of like, they have a lot of like influence from Sweden, and they're very, very similar in a lot of ways, but I also feel like they have some other influences, which makes Finland a very different country than the rest of the Nordic countries. And the country, as we move to the furthest country north, we've got Iceland. Now, I've actually been to Reykjavik, just the airport though, and I've looked out the window and it was just like foggy and cloudy. And I've heard that because of their hot springs and what they've got going on that island, they have a lot of that foggy cloudiness. But I've watched a lot of videos and seen a lot of pictures from Iceland, and it looks like an amazingly beautiful country, but I also think of it as like just an extremely cold country. And I also think of it as being a very expensive country just because they're kind of like in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and North America. So it's gonna cost a lot for them to get a lot of the things shipped over. But Iceland seems like an amazing place. I definitely want to check out more of it. And I'm also really, really fascinated by the language in Iceland because I've heard that the Icelandic language is the closest Scandinavian / Nordic language to the Old Norse language, which is very, very fascinating to me. I think languages are super interesting, and like I'll go back and like listen to like Middle English or Old English and won't understand like a single thing, but you can see like the translations and like kind of like try to put it together and stuff, and it's like so fascinating to me to see how like languages evolve over time. So those are my thoughts on the countries that neighbor Sweden. I'm really, really interested to see what you guys have to think that have actually been there. Am I right on these? Or I could be completely wrong. So let me know in the comment section if you like this video. Be sure to give it a thumbs up. Thanks so much for watching. See you guys in the next video.
Yes, I did.